So in our last video, we looked at the DOM core specification. And as we went through there, you probably thought, boy, this seems like a really redundant way to do a lot of these things. Some of the ways that we were getting child elements and children of children and siblings of children, they got a little confusing, maybe a little bit long and tedious to code. In this video, we're going to talk about the DOM HTML specification. Okay. So the HTML specification doesn't really provide any new functionality. The HTML specification provides us shortcuts. So it makes those things that we were looking at in the last video, it makes them a little bit easier. So let's look at some of the properties that we can use with the DOM HTML specification. So all elements with the DOM HTML specification have properties for their ID, the title, the class name, or the tag name. The tag name is like a div or an H1 or H2. Class name would be a class attribute. We have a title attribute and an ID attribute. All elements can have these things. Anchor elements can have an href attribute, so we can manipulate the link reference, the hypertext reference for a link. Images will have a source and an alt that we can manipulate. And an input, any input can be disabled or enabled. So we can use its disabled property, set it to true to disable an input so people can't type in it if we don't want them to. So let's look at how the DOM HTML specification can simplify your code. How does it make your coding easier? So up here, we're going to be using the DOM core specification to do something. So what we're doing is we're using the dollar selector, going out and getting the item off of our web page that has an ID of image. So obviously it's going to be an image of some kind. And we're storing a reference to that in this constant called image element. And then we're getting the image element, and we're getting its attribute. We're looking for its source and alerting that, showing it to the user. But then we're going to use the image element. We're going to do set attribute. We're going to set the source to lion.jpg. So whatever it was before, now it's pointing to the file lion.jpg for the source for that image. Let's do the same thing now using the DOM HTML specification. We're still using the dollar selector, the dollar function, to get the item with an ID of image. That's no different. But now we can just do this, image element dot source. Okay, so we're using this dot source property to look at the image element and putting that out in an alert, in a pop-up. Does the same thing that this alert does. This is just shorter and easier to write. So you'll probably find yourself liking to use the DOM HTML specification a lot more than the DOM core specification. And then the same thing, to set the image on an image element, we could call set attribute source, but down here we can just say image element dot source equals lion.jpg. A little bit shorter, a little bit easier to write than the DOM core specification. So that's what the DOM HTML specification does. Again, same functionality. This one is just a little bit easier. It's kind of a shortcut and an easier way to do things. Here's some other examples of using the DOM HTML specification. We can do a document query selector all to get all the anchor tags and store it in a constant called links. Okay, so that's going to be an array with all the A elements in it. We can also use, if we want to get the first link out, since this is an array, we can just get item 0, get its ID, and store it as the first link ID. So we can access its ID property for that link. If we want to get the href attribute from an anchor element, we can use the dollar function to go out and get the first link and just hit its .href property and store it in target. If we want to get class element class attributes of an element. I can go out and get the use the dollar selector here, class name open plus. Okay, so I'm setting the class names there for all the divs to open plus. And here I'm going out and getting all the class names of all the divs, all the classes that they contain, and storing it in an array called class names. Okay, so this code is shorter and easier. It's a shortcut. The DOM HTML specification is a tool for us to use to make our code simpler and easier to read, to access the items on our web page. Another example, how to get the tag attribute for the first element in an array. So we're going to get all the anchor tags and store them in an array called links. Okay. And then I can pull out the tag name for links sub 0, which is the first tag, and store it. If I want to disable or enable an element, here's the play button. I'm assuming it's a button because it's using btn here and it has the word play in it. It's the play button. So we're going out and looking for the element that has an ID of button play, and we're setting its disabled property to true. That disables that button so nobody can press it. If we set disabled to false, that enables the button so it can be pressed or clicked. All right, so far we've learned some ways that we can work with class attributes, with the set attribute and remove attributes. We saw those up here. Can't remember exactly where it was, but they're all or nothing. If we use a set attribute for class, it sets all the classes to a certain thing or removes them all. And that's not always the way we want to do things. So the element interface, so all elements have a class list property, and we can use that class list property. When we do that, it gets an object that contains all the class names that are in the class attribute for whatever element we're looking at. It has some properties. We can see the length. We can see how many classes have been applied to that element. And we can get the class names in a string that we can manipulate if we want to. But there's some methods too that are really, really handy. So we can look at an element to see if it has a certain class. So we can see if that element contains a class name, if a class name is applied to it. We can add a class, okay, which is better than what we did before when we did set attribute, because when we did set attribute, whatever we set it to was final. Whatever was on it before it all went away. This actually lets us, if there's 2 or 3 classes applied, it lets us add another class name to that list of classes that are applied. Likewise, we can remove a single class without removing all the other classes using the remove method. We can replace a class, specify the class we want to replace, and then tell it what new class we want to apply. And we can also use toggle, which is really, really handy, where we can toggle a class name to basically apply that class and take it away. If it's not there and we toggle it, it adds the class. If the class is already there and we toggle it, it takes the class away. And that's a really, really handy tool. So let's take a look at this. We have an H2 element that has a class applied to it. The class is first. And it says, welcome to our website. And that's the end of our H2. So we can do document query selector to pull out our H2 element. Okay, so now we have this H2 element stored in heading 2, this constant. And now what I can do is I can say heading2.classList add blue. So now our H2 will have class first and class blue applied to it. If we want to, then we can do heading2 classList.replace, and we can replace blue with red. Really handy. We're replacing one class with another class out of the class list. And then finally here, we're taking heading2, looking at its class list and removing the red class, and we're back to it only having class first applied to it. Those are really handy tools. Much more flexible to use than completely adding a whole list of classes or removing all the classes. We get to pick classes on an item by item basis using these methods. And then here, we're using the same thing that we did over here. Our H2, we're heading to.classList. We're toggling blue. So that added blue. The next time we run it, toggles blue. Since blue's already on, it takes blue off. And then when we toggle it again, since blue is off, it turns blue back on. We can turn on and off a class that's applied to an element. Comes in very handy. We can also check. Let's do this. Heading to class list. Does it contain blue? And if it does, since we're using an if statement here, we're going to set the class list. We're going to add bold. So if the class list is blue, we're also going to add the bold class, which I assume makes that text look bold. I assume that's what's applied in that CSS for the class bold. All right, we've talked about the document object model. We've talked about the nodes. We went over the DOM core specification, which was a little confusing. We talked about the interfaces. All these methods and things that are applied come from interfaces. We've been scripting the DOM. That's what we've been doing this whole time, is finding different ways that we can access the DOM to see what's in it and to change its contents. And we talked about the DOM HTML specification, which basically provides us a lot of shortcuts and easier ways to manipulate things that are in the DOM core specification. In the next video, we'll take a look at some applications and see how these things are actually used in the live application.